rotor blades tear the winter air above Kabul, chopping through darkness as armored columns roll across the border and into a country the Soviet Union claims it has come to save. Orders crackle over radios, paratroopers grip steel floors, faces pale under red lights, rehearsing door kicks and room clears. In the capital, gunfire erupts around the presidential palace as elite Soviet units move with terrifying speed, sealing stairwells, cutting communications, hunting a man Moscow no longer trusts. Outside the cities, mountains wait, silent, immense, unforgiving. Villages wake to the sound of engines and the glare of flares. What begins tonight is sold as a limited intervention, a stabilizing mission, a brief show of force. But the first shots fired in December 1979 do not end quickly. They open a decade of ambushes, air assaults, and political miscalculations that will bleed an empire, harden a resistance, and transform a remote Cold War theater into a global reckoning. By late 1979, Afghanistan sits at the edge of collapse, not because it has chosen a side in the Cold War, but because internal revolution has torn its institutions apart. The People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan has seized power in a coup the year before, promising radical reform in a conservative tribal society. Land redistribution, literacy campaigns, and ideological purges are imposed with speed and violence. Resistance spreads from villages to valleys, and the new regime fractures from within. In Moscow, the leadership watches a friendly government unravel along the Soviet Union's southern flank, adjacent to Muslim-majority Soviet republics, and fears contagion, instability, and the loss of influence in a region long considered strategically sensitive. The Afghan president, Hafizullah Amin, has become a problem. He is ruthless, unpredictable, and increasingly suspected of flirting with the West. Soviet advisors on the ground report chaos and brutality that only deepen rebellion. KGB assessments paint a grim picture. The regime may fall, and if it does, Moscow's prestige will fall with it. Within the Politburo, debate hardens into decision. Intervention is framed as temporary, surgical, and necessary. The plan is to remove Amin, install a more pliable leader, stabilize the cities, and withdraw once order is restored. The assumptions are confident, the timelines are short, the mountains are underestimated. On 24 December 1979, the invasion begins. Soviet transport aircraft stream south, carrying airborne troops and equipment. Motorized rifle divisions cross the border under winter skies. The first priority is control: airfields, roads, ministries, communications. Soviet doctrine emphasizes speed and shock, overwhelming the capital before opposition can coalesce. In Kabul, special units move against the Taj Beg Palace. The assault is brutal and efficient. Amin is killed. Within hours, Babrak Karmal is announced as the new leader, flown in under Soviet protection, his legitimacy tied immediately to foreign bayonets. For the soldiers on the ground, the mission feels ambiguous from the start. Conscripts from Ukraine, Siberia, and Central Asia find themselves in unfamiliar terrain, confronting a population that does not welcome them as liberators. A motor rifleman remembers the first patrols through Kabul's streets, children watching silently, shopkeepers closing shutters, the sense of being observed. Orders are clear: secure, patrol, deter, but the enemy is not. There are no front lines, no declared armies facing each other across fields. Instead, there are whispers, sudden shots, and roads that seem peaceful until they explode. Soviet strategy initially mirrors expectations formed in Europe. dominate urban centers, secure lines of communication, and use superior firepower to suppress resistance. Armored vehicles rumble through valleys, helicopters ferry troops to high ground, artillery is called to break suspected strongpoints. Yet the resistance adapts quickly. Afghan fighters, later known collectively as the Mujahideen, disperse into the countryside, drawing on local knowledge, tribal networks, and the cover of rugged geography. They strike convoys, lay mines, and vanish into villages and mountains where Soviet units cannot distinguish fighter from farmer. Political aims and military realities begin to diverge. Moscow wants stability and a loyal government. The army is tasked with counterinsurgency in terrain that negates many of its advantages. Soldiers describe long marches at altitude, engines failing in thin air, weapons jamming with dust. A helicopter pilot recalls flying low through valleys to avoid shoulder-fired weapons, feeling the aircraft shudder as rounds snap past, landing troops who will be extracted hours later under fire. Each operation clears ground briefly, only for resistance to seep back once units withdraw. As months turn into years, the war escalates. Soviet forces increase in number and intensity. Spetsnaz units conduct raids against supply routes. Air power becomes central, with gunships providing overwatch and transport helicopters sustaining remote outposts. Villages suspected of harboring fighters are searched, sometimes destroyed, in efforts to separate insurgents from the population. These tactics, however, often achieve the opposite, driving civilians toward the resistance and deepening hostility. A young Soviet officer writes home about the moral confusion, protecting convoys one day, guarding detainees the next, never certain whether the people they pass will warn of an ambush or guide it. Internationally, the conflict widens. The invasion shocks the world and hardens Cold War lines. The United States, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and others funnel money, weapons, and training to the Mujahideen. What began as a local uprising becomes a proxy war. The introduction of more advanced weapons changes the battlefield. For Soviet air crews, the skies grow more dangerous. A transport pilot remembers the moment flares became routine, the constant scanning for launch plumes, the knowledge that a single hit could doom crew and passengers alike. Within Afghanistan, the human cost mounts. Refugees flood across borders. Entire regions are depopulated. The Kabul government survives, but only behind Soviet armor and advisors. Efforts at political reform fail to win broad support. The resistance, fragmented and often divided, is united by opposition to foreign occupation. Fighters tell of patience as a weapon, waiting days for a convoy, choosing the moment, striking, withdrawing. For them, time is an ally. For the Soviets, it is an enemy. Back in Moscow, confidence erodes. Casualties rise, though official figures minimize losses. Coffins return quietly to provincial towns. Veterans come home with stories that do not match official narratives. The war strains the economy and the morale of the armed forces. Commanders rotate, strategies shift, but no decisive solution emerges. Clearing operations are followed by negotiated truces that collapse. Development projects are announced and abandoned. The gap between declared objectives and achievable outcomes grows. By the mid-1980s, the conflict has become a war of endurance. Soviet units hold bases and cities, venturing out in heavily protected columns. The resistance controls much of the countryside at night and large areas by day. Soldiers speak of routine danger, roads that must be traveled, hills that must be climbed, patrols that must be walked, each carrying the possibility of sudden violence. A medic recalls treating wounds under fire, the difficulty of evacuation, the sense that survival often depends on luck as much as skill. Political change in the Soviet Union eventually brings reassessment. New leadership questions the cost and purpose of the war. Negotiations begin, seeking a face-saving exit that preserves some stability. The decision to withdraw is made not in triumph, but in resignation. The last years are marked by preparations, handovers, and continued fighting as forces pull back. On the ground, soldiers focus on getting home alive. Convoys move with caution, helicopters lift off under fire, bases are dismantled. When the final columns cross back over the border, the war leaves no clear victory. Afghanistan is shattered, its future uncertain. The Soviet Union has demonstrated power, but also its limits. For the men who fought, the invasion is remembered not as a brief intervention, but as a grinding conflict that reshaped lives and expectations. For the world, December 1979 stands as a moment when a superpower stepped into the mountains believing it could control events, and discovered that war, once begun, rarely obeys the plans drawn in distant capitals. The legacy of the invasion does not end with withdrawal. The institutions Moscow tried to prop up remain fragile, dependent on external aid, and riven by internal rivalries. The fighting continues among Afghan factions, now armed, trained, and hardened by years of war. The countryside bears scars: cratered roads, ruined irrigation, abandoned villages, visible reminders of a conflict that fused local grievances with global rivalry. For many Afghans, the Soviet departure does not bring peace, only a new phase of struggle. For Soviet veterans, the war becomes a defining, often unspoken experience. They return to a society uneasy with defeat and reluctant to acknowledge sacrifice. Medals are awarded quietly. Stories are shared among comrades, not celebrated publicly. The lessons learned about counterinsurgency, cultural misunderstanding, and the limits of military force are paid for in blood and time. Officers later reflect that doctrine built for large-scale conventional war proved ill-suited to a conflict where the enemy chose when and where to fight. Strategically, the invasion marks a turning point in the Cold War. It accelerates distrust, fuels arms races, and reshapes regional politics. Afghanistan becomes synonymous with quagmire, a cautionary tale invoked by policymakers and generals alike. The belief that a superpower can impose stability through force alone is challenged by the realities of geography, culture, and popular resistance. Mountains that seemed peripheral on maps assert themselves as decisive actors. For the men who crossed the border in December 1979, memory often returns to small moments rather than grand strategy. The weight of winter gear, the thump of rotor blades at dawn, the silence before an ambush, the relief of surviving another patrol. They remember comrades lost, promises made, and the slow realization that the mission had no clear end. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan begins with confidence and urgency, but it endures as a lesson written over 10 long years, a lesson about power, resistance, and the unpredictable consequences of war.